Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. This fairly short video is going to give you a quick introduction to working with pivot charts in VBA. We'll start the video with a quick recap of creating pivot caches and pivot tables, which you're going to need if you want to create a pivot chart in the first place. When we create pivot charts, we'll look at the difference between embedded charts and separate chart sheets and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each. Then we'll look at how you can modify the pivot chart fields, essentially by modifying the underlying pivot table that the chart is based on. We'll do the same thing when it comes to filtering your pivot charts, again by filtering the pivot table. And then the last part of the video is going to have a quick look at how you can format your chart using things like chart layouts, chart styles and chart colours. So let's get started. Okay, so the starting point for this video is our usual Excel table of movie data. If you don't already have a copy of this workbook, you can download it using the link in the video description. This video is going to combine a few different techniques from some of the previous videos we've looked at in this series. So we're going to combine some techniques working with charts and some techniques working with pivot tables. If you'd like more of a detailed background on either of those two types of objects, then we've got a whole range of videos already as part of this series. So if you have a quick look for the Excel VBA Introduction playlist on the YSL channel, you'll find there's a couple of hours worth of videos on charts there already. So we've got Introduction to Charts and Embedded Charts, then a whole range of videos on working with pivot tables. Mainly these are focused on using different data sources. For this particular video, we're going to be working with just our Excel movie table. And the first thing we need to do actually is create a pivot table based on this data set. Every pivot chart has to be based on a pivot table, so it kind of makes sense to create the pivot table first. So to do that, we're going to head to the Developer tab and then straight into the Visual Basic Editor. Then we'll have a brand new module for this, and we'll have a quick subroutine called Create Pivot Table. As usual, in order to create a pivot table, you're going to need a pivot cache, and the pivot cache is going to serve both the pivot table and the pivot chart eventually. So let's declare a variable to hold a pivot cache object, so I'll say dim_pc as pivot cache, and then I can create a new pivot cache in the standard sort of way, so I'm going to say setPC equals this workbook dot pivot caches dot create. Now there are several parameters to fill in here, of course, as usual. So the first parameter is going to be the source type. Now because this is a range of Excel cells, the correct source type to use here is Excel database. And then, having set the Excel database, I can set the source data to refer to the range of cells containing my data. Now I want to make this as robust and dynamic as possible, so I don't want to have this situation whereby if I change the data range or change the worksheet name later on, my code falls over. So I'm going to concatenate a range or source data range by saying wsmovies.name, followed by concatenating an exclamation mark, and then concatenating a reference to the range of cells on that worksheet. So wsmovies.range a1.currentregion.address. It's the same sort of technique we've used in previous videos to make sure that you get a dynamic range of cells referred to. We don't need to specify the version of the pivot table being created, or the pivot cache being created, I should say, but you can always say that if you want to, so you get to set the version to be a specific version of pivot table. So I can say Excel pivot table version, and the version of Excel that I'm using is Excel 2013 for this video, so the internal version number for that is version 15. So it's not necessary, but let's just say it anyway. Now I'd like to create my pivot table and a new worksheet on which to put it as well, so let's declare a couple of extra variables at the top. We'll say dim_ws as worksheet, and then we'll also say dim_pt as pivot table. And then we can create a new worksheet in the usual way. We'll say setWS equals worksheets.add. I'm also going to change the name of that sheet once it's been created. I'm going to say ws.name equals movie table. I'll then select range A3 on the sheet. That's where I'd like my pivot table to begin. So range A3.select. And then to create the pivot table, that's just the usual thing. We're going to say setPT equals pc.createPivotTable. Now there's a couple of parameters I'm going to fill in here. So the table destination, first of all, I'm going to set the table destination to be equal to the active cell. So that's going to be range A3. That'll form the top left hand corner of the pivot table. And then I'm also going to set a table name as well. So let's set the table name property, or parameter, sorry, table name equals movie pivot. All I'd like to do now is populate the pivot table with some row, column, page and data fields. So let's say pt.addFields first of all, and there are several fields I can pass in here. So let's set the row fields first of all. We're going to modify this a little bit later on, so it's not too important what we put in right at this point. I'm going to set the row fields to be equal to the country column first. Then let's have some column fields as well, or a column field. So I'll say column fields equals, and I'm going to set that to be equal to the certificate column. And then I'll also set up a page field as well. Excuse me, sorry, that should have been an underscore character. Then the page fields will be equals studio. I'd also like to add in a data field, so I'm going to use a separate method for that. I'm going to say pt.addDataField, and then I've got to reference a field in the pivot table, so I can't just put in its name like a string. For the add data field method, I've got to actually reference a field object. So I can say field equals, then pt.pivot fields, open some parentheses and double quotes. I'm going to use the runtime field, so the runtime in minutes, and then I'd also like to set the function that I'm using here as well. So I'm going to use the function parameter and make that equal to an Excel consolidation function. So just so I can see the list, I can say Excel consolidation function dot Excel average. It might make sense to apply a bit of basic formatting here as well. So if I'm using the average, I'm likely to end up with quite a lot of decimal places. So I can say pt dot data fields, and then I can refer to the first data field and set its number format property to be equal to 0.00. So just the same sort of stuff we've done many times in the past few videos in this series. But just to make sure that this works, let's just execute the procedure at this point and make sure that we end up with a new worksheet called Movie Table with a basic pivot table sitting there. Now that we've got the pivot table set up, we can easily create a chart that's based on the pivot table's data range, which will automatically make the chart a pivot chart. Now, the only real question you've got to ask at this point is whether you want to create an embedded chart that sits on the worksheet alongside the table, or whether you'd rather create a chart that sits as a separate worksheet. It doesn't really matter because you can switch between the two at any point later on anyway, but just to demonstrate the basics of creating a chart object which sits alongside the same table on the same worksheet, let's head back to the VB editor and we'll create a new subroutine called something like create pivot chart embedded. Now you can do this in a couple of ways, but one fairly simple, straightforward way to do this is to add an item to the shapes collection of the worksheet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to declare a couple of simple variables. First of all, dim sh as shape, which will hold a reference to the chart object that I'm going to add in. I'm also going to say dim ws as worksheet. I'd like to get a reference to the worksheet on which I'm going to add my shape. This isn't necessary at all, it just makes the code a little bit easier to read and write. So I'm going to set ws to be equal to worksheets, and I know that I gave my worksheet a sensible specific name earlier on. I called it movie table, so I can reference that one by name like so, and then I can say set sh equal to ws.shapes.addChart2. The exact name of the method you'll see will depend somewhat on which version of Excel you're using. So in Excel 2013, the default name of this method is addChart2. If it still says addChart, then don't worry, this will still work. So I'm going to say addChart2 and then open up some parentheses. There are a few basic parameters I can fill in here as well, so I can control the size of the chart and the position using the left, top, width and height properties. I can also choose a chart type. So let's just choose a couple of basic things here. I'm going to put in a space underscore, and I'm going to say, I'm going to say Excel chart type equals, and then I'm going to use Excel chart type, and then I'm going to look for a stacked column chart, so Excel column stacked. I'm just going to modify the left, top, width and height properties relatively quickly as well. Of course, all these can be changed afterwards, and we've done this in a lot more detail in the video on working with embedded charts, but just really quickly I'm going to set left to be equal to, let's say, 300, so that's the distance between the left of the chart and the left hand edge of the worksheet. Then I can say top, and this is the distance between the top of the chart and the top of the worksheet, so I'm going to set that to be something like 100, and then I'm going to set the width to be equal to, let's say, 500 or so, and then the height, I'm going to make that equal to, let's say, 400 or so. Hopefully those properties or those parameters are fairly straightforward and easy to understand. So, simply having done that, if I were to run this subroutine right now, I will end up with, sitting alongside my pivot table, I'll end up with my pivot chart embedded chart object. Now the reason that my chart already shows the same data as the pivot table is because I have a cell selected in the pivot table when the chart is created. If that wasn't the case, I'd end up with an empty chart and I'd need to set its source data. So just to demonstrate that principle, let me just delete this chart object manually, and then let's add a line of code that will, in fact, let's just manually select a cell that's clearly not within the pivot table range. If I then head back to the VB editor and then just run this exact same subroutine again, when I get back to the Excel workbook, you'll see I've got a new chart object, but it doesn't have any data. So, just to make sure that the data range of the chart is set regardless of which cell was selected when the chart gets created, I want to add an extra line of code to this subroutine. So I'm going to say, first of all, I'm going to declare a new variable actually that's going to let me refer to the chart element of the shape that's been created. So I'm going to declare a variable dim ch as chart, and then what I can do in there is say set ch to be equal to sh.chart. This just makes it slightly easier now to access the chart's set source data method. So there's a method there called set source data, and all I need to do at this point is refer to a range of cells containing the data that I want. Now the range of cells that I want to reference is the table range of the pivot table on this worksheet. There are several ways I can do this, but just for convenience I'm going to declare a separate variable that allows me to get a reference to the pivot table. So I'm going to say dim pt as pivot table. What I can then do is, after I've got a reference to the chart, I can say set pt equals ws.pivot_tables. Then I know that it's the only pivot table on the worksheet, so I could say legitimately pivot tables 1, quite simply, but I also gave my pivot table a sensible name earlier on as well. I gave it a unique specific name of movie pivot, so I can reference it like so as well. So once I've said ch.setSourceData, I can refer to pt.TableRange. I can go with either table range 1 or table range 2. The only difference between these two is that table range 1 doesn't include the page fields, whereas table range 2 does include the page fields. For a pivot table, it really doesn't actually matter which of the two you use. It will still base the pivot chart on the entire pivot table anyway. So I'm going to say table range 1, and then if I just make sure that I haven't got a cell in the pivot table selected, if I switch back to the VB editor and then execute the subroutine again, we'll find this time, even though I didn't have a cell in the pivot table selected, the data range of the chart has still been set to the data range of the pivot table. One of the other nice things about being able to refer to the table range of the pivot table is it lets us control the position of the chart objects more effectively as well. So what I'd like to do first of all is write a quick routine that's going to clear up all the chart objects that I've currently added to the worksheet, so I don't have to delete them all by hand each time. So let's just switch back to the VB editor and we'll add in a new quick subroutine that will say delete all chart objects. Now again, this is something we've gone into in a bit more detail in the video on embedded charts, but just to very quickly cover this, I'm going to declare a variable called CO as a chart object. So even though you add charts by using the shapes collection, when you've created an embedded chart, it becomes an object in the chart objects collection. So you can loop over the chart objects independently of other shapes on your worksheet, such as buttons and auto shapes and embedded images and so on. So I'm going to say for each CO in worksheets, and I gave my worksheet a sensible name earlier on, so it's called movie table, and I can then refer to the chart objects collection on that worksheet. I'll say next CO, and then for each chart object in that collection, all I would like to do is say co.delete. So if I just execute that subroutine at this point, and then quickly check back that I've deleted all of the chart objects, I can then head back to the VB editor and add some more code to the create pivot chart embedded routine that will change the position of the chart object. The first thing I'll do is get rid of the parameters left and top from the statement we used to create the pivot chart in the first place, because what I'll do then is change the position of the chart after it's been created. So down below, once I've set the source data for the chart, I can refer to the sh object, so the shape that we originally create. So I can say sh.top equals, and all I'd like to do is set it to be equal to the top of the table range 1 property of the pivot table. So remember, table range 1 is the range of cells that form the pivot table excluding the page fields. So if I were to just run that subroutine at this point and then switch back to the VB editor, you'll see the new chart has been created, but its top is sitting exactly in line with the top of the pivot table itself. Just to quickly change the left position of the chart object then, I'd like to change it so that it's equal to the left-hand edge of the pivot table range plus the width of the pivot table range plus a small buffer just to offset it ever so slightly past the right-hand edge of the pivot table. So to make that work, again back in the VB editor, I'm going to make a quick call in this subroutine to delete all the existing chart objects on the sheet first. So let's just add a quick line up here that says delete all chart objects, so I don't have to keep on doing that manually. And then I can head back down to the bottom here and say sh.left equals pt.tablerange1.left plus pt.tablerange1.width plus, let's say, 10 points or so. That should be enough of a little buffer there. So having done that, if I just run this subroutine one more time, I'll end up with my new charts object positioned just about where I want it, just to the right hand side of the pivot table itself. So creating embedded pivot charts is a little bit fiddly because you have to control the position and the size of the object. It's sometimes more convenient just to create a completely separate chart altogether. So what I'm going to do at this point is create a new chart which sits as a separate chart sheet and then set its source data to be equal to that pivot table data range. So to make that work, let's switch back to the VB editor and I'm going to create a new subroutine called something like create pivot chart sheet. Again, we've done this in quite a lot of detail in previous videos, so let's just very quickly go through creating a new chart sheet. I'm going to say dim ch as chart, and then I'm going to say set ch equals charts.add. So it's very similar to adding a new worksheet to the worksheets collection. Once I've created the chart sheet, I can set its name. I'm going to say ch.name equals movie chart, just like I set the name of the worksheet earlier on. And then what I'd really like to do is set the source data for that chart. So that's very similar to setting the source data for the embedded chart object. So it's going to help if I have a reference to the pivot table. So in fact I'm going to just copy and paste the line which sets a reference to the movie pivot on that worksheet. So let's just have a quick look at doing that. I'm going to say dim ws as worksheet and then dim pt as pivot table. And I'm going to, pivot table. I'll spell pivot properly eventually. Pivot table, there we go. And then I can paste in the line that I've just copied. So I need to set a reference to the worksheet as well. So let's just switch back up to the top there and get a reference to that worksheet as well. So having named everything sensibly, this should work reasonably well. So having done that, all I've got to do now is set the source data for the chart. And again, that's incredibly similar to doing it for the individual embedded chart object. So I can say ch.setSourceData pt.tablerange1. So again, just a very quick copy paste of that line of code. So having done that, if I were to run this subroutine now, I'll end up with a new chart object, or sorry, not a chart object, a chart sheet, and then switch back to Excel just to see that it exists. I haven't changed the charts type, so it gives me a clustered column chart rather than a stacked column chart as I chose earlier on, but the overall end result is the same. I just get a separate chart sheet rather than an embedded chart. Now in terms of manipulating either type of pivot chart, embedded or a separate chart sheet, essentially all you're really doing is manipulating the pivot table. So anything that you manipulate in the pivot chart, you can see the pivot chart fields list here, is going to change the exact same thing in the underlying pivot table. It's unavoidable. So there are several ways you can approach doing this. What I'm going to do quickly is switch back to the VB editor and let's create a new subroutine that allows us to edit our pivot chart. So I'm going to say subroutine sub edit pivot chart. The first thing we're going to do is get a reference to the pivot table on which the pivot chart is based. So we'll have a variable to do that as usual, dim pt as pivot table. And then the ways that you can get a reference to the pivot table, you can either go directly to its source. So I could say set pt equals worksheets, and again remembering the name that I gave it earlier on was movie table. And then I can refer to pivot tables, and I gave the name of the pivot table movie pivot. Or I could just refer to pivot tables 1, of course, there's only one pivot table on that sheet, and that will get a reference to the pivot table. Alternatively, what I could do is get a reference to the chart and then refer to the pivot table of the chart object. So to do that, I could say dim ch as chart, and then I can get a reference to my chart object. I could say set ch equals charts, and I gave my chart a name of movie chart, sensibly, so I can say movie chart, and then I can say set pt equals ch dot pivot layout dot pivot table. So that gets a reference to the pivot table on which this pivot chart is based. So either of these two techniques would work, but that's the important first step, getting a reference to the pivot table. I'm going to leave this line in here just for reference, but I'm going to comment out this line. There's no point in setting the reference twice. So at this point now we can set about modifying the way the pivot table looks to update the look of the pivot chart as well. The first change I'd like to make to the chart and the table is to remove all of the existing visible fields. So for convenience, I'm going to declare a variable at the top called pf as pivot field, and then rather than doing this one by one, we can loop over the pivot fields collection. In fact, not just the pivot fields collection, I can loop over the visible fields collection, so the ones that have currently been added to the pivot table. So let's say for each pf in pt.visible fields. Now for each one of those, all I'm going to do is change its orientation to make it hidden. So I can say pf.orientation equals Excel hidden. Now having done that, currently if I just restore down the VBA editor window, so you can see in the background I've got my pivot chart with all the fields in place. And again, if I look at the movie table worksheet, that chart and that pivot table also have all their fields in place. If I simply set about running this subroutine now, I'll find that the entire pivot table gets all of its fields removed, as well as the embedded chart and of course the separate chart sheet. So everything's completely linked together. All the charts are based on the pivot table, so changing one changes the other. What I'd like to do now is replace the fields I've just removed with some other fields. The simplest way to do that is to head back up to the code where we added in the pivot fields earlier on. So I'm going to take the add fields method, and in fact the add data field method there as well. So let's take all of that and copy it and then paste that down into this edit pivot chart routine. So rather than having the row field set to country, I'm going to change the row fields so that they're set to studio. And I'm going to change the column fields so that they're set to the genre, and I'm going to take away the studio page field completely. So let's just remove the page fields item. It's an optional parameter, as is row fields and column fields for add fields. For the data field, I'd like to set that to be the budget dollars. So taking away the runtime, I can refer to budget, and then there's also a set of parentheses and a dollar sign in there. And I'd like to use the average function again, just for convenience. So, having done that, if I were to run this subroutine again now, I'll end up with the pivot chart populated with all of the studios and different genres and an average of budget, and then back in the movie table I'll find that the pivot table must also have been set like that as well. I could do with repositioning my my embedded chart at this point, so I could have another routine that repositions it, having changed the design of the pivot table, but I'm going to leave that out for now. So there you go, there's how you can edit the pivot fields of both the table and the chart. As well as modifying the fields that are displayed in the pivot table and the pivot chart, you can filter those fields as well, just like we've shown you in the previous video on working with pivot tables. So just as a very quick recap of that, let's say I wanted to remove, say, the action films and the romance films from my list of displayed results. Let's switch back to the VB editor and we'll create a new, I'll get there eventually, we'll create a new subroutine called filter specific items. I'm going to copy and paste a bunch of code from the previous routine here, so let's just copy the pivot table, chart and pivot field variables and the two lines which set references to the chart and the pivot table. So I'm just going to paste those in down below and get rid of the line that I commented out earlier on. I don't need that sitting there anymore. What I'd then like to do is get a reference to a pivot field. So I'm going to say set pf equals pt.pivot fields, and then I want to refer to the genre field. So let's say genre. What I can now do is refer to individual items in that field. So I could say, for instance, pf.pivot items, then open some parentheses, and the first one I wanted to filter was the action films, so I can say action, then I can say dot visible equals false. And I can do exactly the same thing for the romance films as well, so let's copy and paste that line, change the name of the item from action to romance, and then make that invisible. And if I simply execute that subroutine at that point, switch back to the pivot table or pivot chart, you'll see that the action films and the romance films have been removed. You can see the filter icons appeared on the genre filter here as well. To bring everything back, I could simply make them visible again manually. I can change visible equals true, or I could also just clear all the filters from the pivot table, or from the pivot field in fact. So I could say pf.clear all filters, and if I were to execute that subroutine now, it will kind of fairly redundantly apply a couple of filters and then clear all the filters. But the end result here, of course, is that the action films and sadly the romance films also are back in the pivot chart. So that's a quick, simple technique you can use to filter individual fields and then clear them. It's also possible to loop over the pivot items collection of a pivot field and then test some kind of condition to determine whether it should be filtered out. So let's just make a quick copy of this subroutine and paste it in immediately down below. And this time what I'd like to do is filter based on the length of the studio name for some bizarre reasons. I want to filter out all the studio names with more than 12 letters in their name. So let's head back to the VB editor, and I need to update the name of the subroutine. So I'm going to call this something like filter based on criteria, I guess, something simple like that. And I'm going to declare another variable here as well. So I'm going to say dim pi as pivot item. So we're going to loop over all the pivot items in a single pivot field. So this time I want to get a reference to the studio pivot field rather than genre. And rather than making these specific values or items invisible, what I'd like to do instead is say for each pi in pf.pivot pivot items, beg your pardon. Then I can say next pi, and then inside there I can write an if statement that determines whether something should be made invisible. So I can say if pi.name is, oh sorry, big one, I want to test the length of the pi.name. That's the aim of this. I want to see if it's more than 12 characters. So if len pi.name is greater than 12, then if that's the case, I'd like to make pi.visible equals false. Else pi.visible equals true. So I can say pi.visible equals true. I'll try to get the right property there, visible rather than value, and make that equal to true, and then have an end if. And just to test this, I'm going to quickly comment out the pf.clear all filters, and having written all that code, I can now just run that subroutine, and eventually when it's finished, if I switch back to Excel, I should find that, eventually, it's taking a little while, surprisingly a long time in fact, but eventually we'll end up with, if I go back there we go, finally had quite a lot of rearranging to do for the pivot table, but you can see now that I've got rid of all of the studio names with long names, more than 12 characters. So just to bring all those back again, I can quite happily just click on the filter list and just do this manually. If I just say clear filter from studio, just to bring everything back, that happened a lot quicker than filtering them in the first place. So you can base your filters on all sorts of different criteria. Again, the video on the basic pivot tables covers filters in a little bit more detail than this. That's just to give you a quick recap and a quick reminder of how it works. Okay, so we've done a few basic things to manipulate the pivot table part of the chart. Let's have a look at manipulating the chart parts of the chart. Let's have a quick extra subroutine called something like formatting chart. And the first thing I'd like to be able to do is get a reference to the chart object. So let's have a quick look at doing that. I'm going to declare a variable. I was going to copy and paste it, but it's so quick and simple to do. I'm going to say dim ch as chart, and then I'm going to set a reference to it by copying and pasting the line that gets a reference to our movie chart. There's a few basic things we can do. First of all, I might want to change the chart type finally. So I've been stuck with this clustered column chart rather than a stacked column, which is what I used earlier on. So changing the chart type is incredibly simple. I can simply say ch.chart type, and then I can make that equal to whichever chart type I'm interested in. Sorry, I'll get that spelled correctly, chart type, and I can make that equal to any of the existing chart types. So let's go for this XL column stacked rather than a clustered column chart. Just to quickly run that one, and then if I hit the F5 key and then have a quick look back at the Excel workbook, I'll find that I've now got a a stacked column rather than a cluster column, making it slightly easier to read. Still not perfect, but slightly easier to read. In terms of visual impact, probably the quickest, easiest way to apply lots of changes to the chart is to apply something called a chart style. Now, chart styles involve all sorts of things. They involve sort of layout options, so they'll change the way legends appear, they'll add chart titles for instance, they'll also change the background colours and font colours, etc. So they're a quick, simple way to apply lots and lots of changes to the chart. So if I go back to the VB editor and then I can simply add a new line that says ch.chartStyle. Now, sadly the chart styles are just referenced by numbers, and the numbering is slightly weird. In Excel 2013 at least, the numbers range from 1 to 48, then there's a big gap, and then they go from 201 to 352. Again, in the videos on charts that we've already made, there's a bit more detail about this and how to get a list of all the chart styles so you can see them all. But all I'm going to do in this case is set my chart style to be equal to number 48. Then if I were to run that subroutine and have a look back at that chart, I'll see that it's had a fairly dramatic impact. Now, as well as changing the chart style, which affects basically everything about the chart, you can also apply a layout which affects only the positions of different items in the chart and whether they appear or not. So after I've applied this chart style, I'd like to apply a layout that maybe brings in a chart title, for instance. You can of course change all these things individually, so you can add a chart title and change axes labels individually, but applying a layout is a quick, simple way to make a few changes to the chart in one go. So again, sadly, the chart layouts are just set using simple numbers. There's a slightly smaller range of numbers for the apply layout method. I'm going to use the number 9. The numbers range from 1 to 11 for chart layouts. Now, bear in mind this is a method, apply layout. It's not a property like chart style, so don't make it equal to. I pass the number 9, the layout number, into the apply layout method. It's a parameter, so don't get tripped up by saying equals 9 here. So if I were to run that subroutine, again, it'll make some changes that have already been made, of course, but then if I switch back to the VB editor, you'll see it's made a few different changes. So it's changed the offsetting of the columns, it's added a chart title, it's changed some grid lines I think in the background there, added some data labels. So yeah, chart layouts affect the positions and appearance of different items rather than the colour scheme that's used. Just to try to make things a little bit easier to read here, I'm going to take away the studio column from the category axis box, or the row fields as it would be in the pivot table, just to show you what the intent of this type of chart actually is, or this chart layout. And I'm going to change things around a little bit. I'm going to move the genre into the categories axis, and then I'm going to put the certificate into the legend or the column fields area as it would be in the main pivot table. So still seeing the average of budget for genres and certificates. One last quick little layout change we could make, chart formatting change we could make rather than the layout and the style, is applying a colour scheme. So again, these are relatively straightforward things to change. If I switch back into the VB editor, after I've applied the layout, I can say ch.chartColor. Now again, chart colour is a property rather than a method, so I can make the property equal to, and once again it's just a number. This time it's the numbers 1 to 26. So I'm just going to use the number 13, and if I just run the subroutine at that point, and then have a quick look back at the chart, I'll see I've got a completely different colour scheme used. I actually prefer the other one, to be fair, but anyway, that's how you can change the colour schemes. Of course, once again, you can change the colours of your chart objects on chart items completely independently of each other. You don't need to just apply a basic chart colour scheme, but it's much more convenient to use those to make quick, simple sweeping changes to the entire object. One last thing I'd like to change for this video is the chart title, but I want to do it in such a way that it's not just a simple literal string of text. I want it to be made up of the various fields that I've added to the various areas of the pivot table. So I'd like my chart title in this example to read average of budget by genre and certificate. So that means referencing the actual pivot fields to pick up those captions and names. So to make that work, let's switch back to the VB editor, and probably just in the same subroutine as I'm working in now, I'm going to declare another variable that allows me to reference the pivot table. So I'm going to say dimpt as pivot table. And then once I've modified all these things about the chart, I can say set pt equals ch.pivotlayout.pivot table, just to get a reference to that. And then I can change the title of the chart. So I want to make sure that the chart does actually have a title in the first place. I know that it does because of the layout that I've applied, but just to ensure that, I'm going to say ch.hasTitle equals true. What I can then do is change the title text, and to make life easier I'm going to use a separate variable to build this up. So I'm going to say dim title text equals, as string, beg your pardon, and then I'm going to make eventually, once I've finished declaring it, then I am going to make title text equal to a concatenation of various different things. So title text equals, first of all, I want to refer to the caption of the data field that's in the pivot chart at the moment. So I'm going to say pt dot data fields 1 dot caption. So that will read for me, in this case, it will read average of budget dollars, as it says there. So then I can concatenate that with the words by, and then concatenate that with the name of the row field. So I can again say pt dot row fields 1. I've only got one row field in there, so that's nice and easy. Then I can refer to its name property, and then another ampersand, and I can concatenate the word and then finally I can refer to pt dot column fields, open some parentheses, the number 1, and again dot name. All I've got to do then is set the chart title text. So I can say ch dot chart title dot text equals title text. Okay, so having done all of that, I might just comment out my chart colours. Hopefully that'll use the other chart colours using the chart style from earlier on. If I switch back to the actual chart itself, I can now see that my chart title has changed without that hideous colour scheme that I picked earlier on. So there you go, there's the basics of working with pivot charts. There's not much to it really. If you understand how charts work in general in VBA, then working with the pivot chart isn't that much different. It helps to know a lot about how pivot tables work, of course, to actually manipulate the various objects that appear, but apart from that, it's pretty straightforward. Hope you've enjoyed that one. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the Wisel website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.